Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to the Be Quran podcast. I'm Ali.
And I'm Fatima. In this episode, we're exploring a powerful and, for many, uncomfortable question. Why don't most Muslims mourn Imam Hussein alayhi salam?
It's a topic that touches on history, identity, theology, and even politics. And to guide our discussion, we're drawing from a compelling lecture by Dr. Sayyid Ammar Nakshawani.
We'll break down the common reasons people give for not mourning, from misconceptions and historical revisionism to fear and spiritual disconnect, and we'll dive into the counter-arguments that challenge them all.
Whether you've grown up mourning Imam Hussein every Muharram or you've never really thought about it before, this episode is for you. It's a chance to reflect, question, and maybe even reframe what you've inherited.
So take a breath, open your heart, and let's get into it.
Bismillah.
Today, we're diving into something truly fascinating, maybe quite poignant for many. It's a central question within the Muslim world. Why is it that the majority of Muslims don't mourn Imam Hussein alayhi salam?
Exactly. And for this podcast episode, we're drawing heavily from a really compelling lecture by Dr. Sayyid Ammar Nakshawani.
Yeah, the depth of their history, the specifics of their lives, it can be a bit hazy.
Hazy for many. Okay, so the love is professed, but the details, the gravity, might be missed.
Exactly, and connecting this to the bigger picture, the source brings in a really profound spiritual angle. It says basically that a person with a real connection to all al-Bayt, especially Imam Hussein, has effectively won their dunya and their akhirah, their worldly life and their afterlife. That's a powerful statement, and it applies particularly to Muslims who know about the Prophet and his grandsons. It suggests there's this path to huge spiritual benefit through your really understanding and connecting.
Wow, and the irony on Ashura itself, the day he was killed, the source really highlights that. Some Muslims fasting, yeah, but linking it to Nabi Musa, Moses, and the children of Israel, not Imam Hussein's martyrdom. And even more jarring, maybe, some places holding weddings on Ashura. It's such a stark contrast to the deep mourning for Imam Hussein.
It connects directly to that line in the Ziyarat Ashura, doesn't it, about people taking joy on the day he was killed? It's almost hard to wrap your head around.
It truly is, and it raises a crucial point for the lecture. Dr. Nakshawani argues that really all Muslims should honor the Prophet's grandson in their own way, even if it's just by understanding the sheer weight, the historical gravity of that day.
Okay, so that sets the stage really well. Let's now transition into the specific reasons, or maybe excuses, as the source sometimes frames them. The reasons given for why the majority don't mourn Imam Hussein, and importantly, the counter-arguments Dr. Nakshawani offers. This is where we really get into the nitty-gritty.
Right. The first reason explored is this idea of, well, a lack of reading. The suggestion is that Muslims aren't really a religion of readers in the way they perhaps once were. There's been a historical shift noted. Grandfathers might have had shelves full of diverse religious books, but today's generations may be more up on social media than foundational texts.
That's quite an indictment, isn't it? A potential disconnect from their own intellectual roots.
But what's the counter-argument to that? Is it just accepted?
Well, this is where it gets fascinating. The source offers a really surprising counterpoint.
There is more about Hussein in Sunni books than there is in Shia books.
Really? More in Sunni books?
Yes. Sunni authors, big names like Ibn Jari al-Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Khaldun, al-Bahai, they wrote extensively about Karbala. They even detailed things like Imam Hussein's thirst, his family's captivity. So the argument becomes, if Muslims would just read their own books, they'd find the whole tragedy of Karbala laid out right there. The fundamental truth, the source insists, a quote, drunkard Khalifa, Yazid, tried to change the Prophet's sunnah, and Imam Hussein gave his life so the adhan, the call to prayer, could continue forever. The insight seems to be that the path to understanding might literally be on their own bookshelves if they just engaged with it.
That is profound. So it's less about information not existing and maybe more about access or engagement with their own history.
Which leads us nicely into the second reason the source brings up, fear. It suggests that non-Shia who might actually want to attend a majlis, a mourning gathering, could face serious consequences, like excommunication or even threats of violence from family or their community.
Yeah, and there's a really poignant story in the lecture illustrating this. A young man in Peterborough, UK, he was apparently raised to actively hate, even potentially kill Shia. But through lectures, he found the intellectual path of al-Bayt appealing. But he was terrified his own father would kill him if he found out he attended a majlis.
That's how intense the pressure can be.
Wow, kill him, that's chilling. And it's not just a modern thing. The source gives historical context too. Tanuhi, a Sunni jurist in Baghdad around 300 years after Hijri, he narrated how Barber Hari, a famous Salafi scholar of the time, actually ordered the killing of a woman named Kalab just because she recited majalis for Imam Hussein. Mobs historically attacked people mourning Imam Hussein.
So this fear, it has really deep roots. Gosh, that Peterborough anecdote really stays with you. It highlights these aren't just abstract theological differences, but real personal risks. There's almost an absurd irony there, isn't there? The source mentions some parents might react less negatively if their kid went to a club during Muharram than to Ashiya Majalis. That speaks volumes about how deeply ingrained this fear or opposition must be.
Exactly, and the source notes, quite sadly, that many converts to the path of Imam Hussein have actually lost family ties over their choices. So the impact of this fear, it's very real, very current for individuals and communities.
Okay, let's move to the third common reason people give. Imam Hussein died 1400 years ago. Why are you still crying? This often ties back to a hadith, right, found in Bukhari and Muslim, saying a woman shouldn't mourn more than 3 days, except for her husband, that's 4 months and 10 days. So the argument is basically extended mourning.
Like, this goes against Islamic tradition.
Right, that hadith is frequently cited. But the crucial question the source raises is, does that rule apply universally, to everyone? The lecture challenges that reading. It explains the 3-day limit is generally understood to apply to, let's say, normal individuals, not the absolute highest figures in the religion, like prophets or imams. And the prime example given is the Prophet Muhammad himself. His year of grief, Amal Huzn, literally the year of sorrow, after his wife Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib died. That lasted a whole year. So there's prophetic precedent for longer mourning for significant figures.
Precisely. And then the lecture draws this really provocative parallel. It asks us to consider, why are you still mourning for Palestinians for 75 years? The argument being that Imam Hussein gives sanctity to majalis, and fundamentally, the blood of the martyr should always be honored. The core idea is that the person's stature dictates the mourning's nature and duration.
It's not a one-size-fits-all rule. That comparison does make you pause, highlighting a potential selective application of grief. Okay, this leads into the fourth reason, often framed as the what about argument. You know, people asking, well, why
don't you mourn Hamza or Uthman or Ali in the exact same intense way?
Yeah, what about Ahmadi? The source counters this pretty passionately. The quote is, our life is majalis. Our oxygen is majalis. It asserts that Shia are ready to mourn other deserving figures, like Hamza, the Prophet's uncle, offering even 10 nights of majalis for him, or Jafar, or revered companions like Abu Zar and Salman. But then it introduces a really sharp, provocative point. It directly questions those who might praise figures like Hind, the one who notoriously consumed Hamza's liver, or those who claim figures like Abu Sufyan and Hind are guaranteed paradise, while Abu Talib, the Prophet's own uncle and protector, is supposedly in hell. The implication here is pretty strong, that history has been deliberately changed or selectively told. There's a suggestion of historical revisionism. So the insight isn't that the focus on Hussein means neglecting others. It's about a specific, deeply rooted spiritual connection to his particular sacrifice and what it represents, perhaps in contrast to how other histories have been presented. That's a serious challenge to accepted narratives, urging a critical look at how history gets written and passed down.
Okay, the fifth reason cited for not mourning often involves a claim about following the Prophet's sunnah more closely, implying that mourning isn't part of it.
Right, and this is where the counter-narrative gets really compelling. The source reveals Prophet Muhammad himself cried for Imam Hussein, and this was before Karbala even happened. There were accounts of him asking the angel Gabriel, for soil from Karbala, just to smell it, and he was seen weeping with the young Hussein on his lap.
So the argument is crying for Hussein is following the sunnah.
Exactly. It's not an innovation. It's actually continuing the Prophet's own practice, his own expressed grief for his grandson. Now, why isn't this widely known or emphasized? The lecture suggests it's due to the dominoes of power, politically speaking. Yazid was put in power by Muawiyah. Umayyad was appointed governor by Omar. There's this chain of command, a chain of responsibility that later powers might have wanted to obscure or downplay to protect that lineage of authority. Hiding the Prophet's grief for Hussein protects that chain.
That adds a whole political dimension to why certain traditions might be suppressed. And just to clarify, the source also notes that specific mourning styles, like, say, chest beating, those are personal choices. They aren't obligatory. The main point is expressing that grief and connection however one chooses, and accepting that diversity rather than getting hung up on one specific method.
Absolutely. That's a key distinction. It's about the essence, not just the form.
Okay, so finally, the sixth reason we need to unpack. This is a big one, maybe one of the most persistent claims. It's the argument that Shia mourns primarily out of guilt, because, the claim goes, they invited Imam Hussein to Kufa and then abandoned him.
Leading to his death. How does the source tackle that?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that one. What's the rebuttal?
Well, the source offers a really detailed, nuanced counter that reframes the whole situation. First, it makes a spiritual point. Even if, hypothetically, the Shia were responsible, then crying itself is a sign of tawbah, of repentance, which it argues is better than shedding no tears and showing no remorse at all. But more historically, it points out that Imam Hussein was actually forced out of Medina, first by Yazid's official governor. It wasn't the Kufa invitation that initially displaced him. Medina, full of respected companions, the Sahaba, and Mecca, full of Muslims, they were arguably the first to, in a sense, kill him by not standing up to Yazid, by not protecting him. Kufa, the source argues, was actually a last resort for Imam Hussein. And while, yes, it had a large Shia community that invited him, the majority of Kufa's population at the time was not Shia.
Okay, so Kufa wasn't the starting point, and it wasn't monolithically Shia.
Precisely. And the lecture really dives deep into the story of Muslim Ibn Aqil, Hussein's cousin and envoy to Kufa. It's a truly poignant, tragic narrative that shows the immense pressures. Muslim initially got huge support, thousands pledged allegiance, but the new governor, Ibn Ziyad, launched this absolutely brutal crackdown. Public executions in the main square of Kunasa, Shia figures like Hani ibn Urwa, Mukhtar al-Thaqafi, Mitham al-Tamar, imprisoned or killed. Fear spread like wildfire. Muslim ended up completely isolated, hunted. He found refuge briefly with just one brave woman, Tawa, who secretly loved Imam Ali. He then fought valiantly, completely alone, against hundreds of soldiers. He was struck from behind, hit on the head, eventually captured, and then his martyrdom, his body was thrown from the palace.
Roof, just discarded, scattered on the ground below.
Oh my goodness, that's horrific.
It is, and Imam Hussein received this devastating news, the news of Muslims' martyrdom, while he was still on his way to Kufa. Imagine hearing that. There's this incredibly touching scene described where Imam Hussein later consoles Muslim's little daughter, Hamida. He gently pats her head where she was hurt. And later, Hamida has this interaction with Tawa, the woman who sheltered her father. She senses her father's scent on Tawa and asks this heart-wrenching question: did anyone hold my father's body after he fell? Muslim Ibn Aqil is rightly called the lonely one of Kufa. He sacrificed everything bravely for the cause. So this whole narrative, it shows that Kufa's story isn't simple betrayal. It's marked by extreme fear, brutal state oppression, and incredible individual sacrifice against overwhelming odds.
That really changes the picture. It brings such a raw human element to it. It completely reframes that simplistic Shia killed him narrative by showing the terror and the unbreakable loyalty under duress.
Absolutely. It underscores the complexity. It wasn't just one group's failure. It was a situation shaped by tyranny, fear, and ultimately immense courage from people like Muslim Ibn Aqil.
And that kind of depth, that nuance is exactly what this deep dive has offered us, I feel. Really profound insights. It's unpacked these complex histories, these religious narratives, challenged a lot of common assumptions, I think, and reveals so many layers behind the mourning of Imam Hussein.
It really has, and ultimately it reinforces the universal message in Imam Hussein's sacrifice, doesn't it? Justice, standing against tyranny. And it also underscores how vital critical thinking is when we look at historical events, especially how they shape belief and community today. His legacy really does transcend any single group.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, drawing from all this. What does it truly mean to understand and connect with these huge historical figures, the ones whose lives really shape the fabric of belief, of community? And maybe what role does our own personal inquiry play in uncovering truths, especially truths that might challenge the stories we've inherited or confront information that might feel uncomfortable, maybe even frightening to explore? Thanks for joining us on this podcast episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep seeking the truth.